Well, I guess I'll get started. This is Dennis Ojima, and this is part of our monthly call-in on our Revamp Science webinar discussions. And we've had several very interesting presentations already this year. And, you know, today we have an excellent presentation by Carina, who's with the Southwest Colorado Research Project, and what she's going to be presenting us is sort of an outcome of some of the social-ecological framing of research being done in Southwest Colorado, and some of the, I guess, the input and findings that were put together by a workshop that she and Shannon McNeely and others from that project have put together. And I thought it was a really interesting process of bringing information together and trying to formulate a sort of a joint vision of how some of the socio-ecological issues can be brought into this area of research of looking at the management and scientific interface as we deal with issues of natural resource management around the region. And so with that, I'll let Carina introduce herself and go on with the presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dennis. So I haven't actually been on any of these calls yet, so I was kind of shooting in the dark in the hope that what I've decided to talk about today is going to be hopefully useful to you all. I'm a postdoc at the University of Montana, and my area of expertise is sort of at the interface between knowledge and decision-making, governance more broadly in kind of biodiversity conservation and climate adaptation. I'm not really sure how familiar you all are with our project, so I sort of thought I would just start by outlining the project goals, and then I'm going to sort of talk about why we bothered to develop this conceptual framework and the process we used, talk a little bit about the framework itself, which came out of that workshop which Dennis mentioned, and then some reflections that the PIs have had recently on the framework, and talk a little bit about how it's kind of evolved in the time since the workshop, which was in August last year. So SECR stands for Social, Ecological, Climate Resilience. So as Dennis said, really the intention of this framework and also of our project is really to be looking at that intersection between the sort of social and ecological and climate concerns in this region of the Southwest Colorado. And so the project is really focused on trying to develop useful and usable knowledge to inform adaptation in the public agencies and also the Ute Mountain Ute down here. So we're working with the Park Service, the Forest Service, the BLM, and in the Southwest area, the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. So the idea is not only to sort of look at the ecological components of these adaptation strategies, but also, you know, the sort of social so what and why the kind of people living in this community might care about those particular ecosystems that we're focusing on. But then also to understand the broader decision-making context and how do you bring that knowledge into play. So this question of why bother, this project has a lot of different moving parts. So we have 11, 12 PIs, 9 or 10 different organizations involved, and we're all coming from different places. The project team has not actually worked together as a whole before, and we're also working across 2 different basins. So we're working in the Gunnison Basin and then in the San Juan Basin, and those 2 project teams kind of are a little bit separate. And there's social scientists, there's climate scientists, there's ecological scientists, there's practitioners, and so we kind of needed some kind of framework that was going to unify all of these different perspectives and also kind of help us sort through all of this jargon of all these different words that have different types of interpretations and different ways of being viewed by perhaps people from different disciplines. So the framework was an attempt to kind of tie this complexity into something that would be able to inform not only how we went about thinking about unifying the project, but as we move through the different stages of kind of implementation and analysis. So what we did in this development of the conceptual framework, Shannon and I worked very closely together last year to coordinate a process where a smaller group of people from the project team really closely read and reviewed a bunch of papers, and then we held a workshop with the whole project team where we then kind of went over these different framework papers to try and kind of evaluate them for their strengths and weaknesses and the types of things that we wanted to draw from these different frameworks as relevant to this particular project. And this review process was really guided quite a lot by the National Climate Assessment paper, which outlines the kind of different framings that they're using for vulnerability assessments with the view to the fact that this document had kind of culminated in a whole lot of knowledge from people who had been working in this area, but also that the National Climate Assessment is perhaps something that this project would like to feed into at some point in time. So just quickly, the papers that we were looking at we tried to select a bunch of papers that covered across the different sort of focal areas of the project. So there was some on resilience, there was some on climate adaptation, some on institutional analysis, and then kind of vulnerability and adaptive capacity, and then also a paper about sort of that process of linking science with practice. And then we also more closely evaluated the project methodologies that had been put forward in the project proposal. So that was Molly Cross's adaptation for conservation targets, and then a sort of scenario-based approach to stakeholder engagement. And the idea of the workshop really was to help us to kind of more critically analyze how we were going to bring the different pieces together, but also critically analyze the strengths and weaknesses of those two project methodologies to help us kind of situate what we were doing within a broader body of literature. So one of the really, I think, important things that we came up with at that workshop was a set of guiding principles. And these guiding principles, we developed them at the end of the first day, where kind of everybody in the room went around and said, you know, their key, most important lesson that they had learned from reading these seminal papers. And then we kind of distilled them and summarized them, and it came out that there was a set of principles talking about the kind of components that we wanted to look at, the way we wanted to deal with the question of scale, how we would actually approach the research process, and then what we were going to do about this kind of question of complexity, and then the different types of outcomes that the project was focused on. And the whole way through that process was really clear from all of the project team that we really had a kind of, despite not having worked together before, we had this really strong aspiration for this project to integrate social and ecological and climate knowledge, but also that we were really wanting to be developing something that was going to usefully inform decision-making in these landscapes. So this framework is what we kind of came up with at the workshop, and it's a modification of the framework developed by Turner et al., which was a framework that was kind of quite seminal in trying to draw together sort of vulnerability, contextual-based approaches to thinking about adaptation and vulnerability with the more of the sort of natural hazards-based approach. And there is a lot going on in this framework, which we will absolutely explicitly acknowledge. I don't know if you can you see my arrow that's on there? I guess if you can see my desktop, you can see the arrow. So the boxes in purple here represent the different guiding principles which we had developed as an sort of additional consideration to add on to the Turner et al. Framework. And then when you zoom in closely here, again, there's still quite a lot going on, but we kind of really realize that this project is really about what is going on in place in these particular landscapes. And so this is kind of where we ended up after the workshop. And one of the major differences with this project from the way that this framework was developed before is this kind of central focus in here on that intersection of social, climate, and ecological concerns, which has been a kind of guiding principle that's carried us through to where we are right now. And then also this additional consideration of governance factors, which again comes from the project's focus on wanting to connect to governance, to connect to decision making in these different landscapes. And I'm going to leave it at that because I'm going to kind of come back to this in terms of how we've actually gone from this kind of big, complex framework to then applying it in the way that we've used it in the project. But something that, so this, one of the things that our project team has also made a commitment to do is to kind of self-evaluate and reflect on our learning as we go through this project. Part of that is to help us kind of improve on our weaknesses as we go along, but it's also part of the process of trying to document what happens when you go about doing this knowledge co-production across social scientists, ecological scientists, climate scientists, practitioners. So I used this webinar as an excuse to kind of gather some reflections on where we're at right now. And as you can see from these quotes up here, there's sort of some different perspectives there. So it was really useful at the time. The workshop, it seems that people kind of unanimously agreed that the workshop was an immensely helpful thing for us. It was really the first thing that we had done as a project team, and for everybody to come together and kind of review those papers and develop some shared language and shared understandings and the shared guiding principles which we had developed. But then coming out the other side of it, the framework itself has kind of, we revisited it at a project meeting in November, and we had, after the workshop, we had a sort of small team of people kind of review and refine and tidy up the outputs of the workshop. And then the framework in its totality hasn't really gone that far since then. And I get the sense that this kind of quote down here, I've kept the framework in mind, but only vaguely, is sort of how I feel that the project team has come to it. And I think this quote down the bottom here, sort of the framework was too complex. It didn't necessarily resonate with everybody. It is kind of revealing because there's all this stuff going on in it, but really the project isn't necessarily focused on that whole complex system, but I think that it's still really important for us to understand that what we are focused on is situated within that kind of broader, complex context. So now thinking about how we've been putting this to use, and this slide really quite significantly draws on where we're at in the San Juan project team. So I have been less involved with what's going on in the Gunnison Basin. And so this is kind of a reflection of how we have taken that framework and used it to guide the different stages of the process. And as we acknowledged at the workshop, the conceptual framework is a sort of an evolving beast. which we will be looking at and refining and thinking through as we go. So we've gone from this kind of complexity and this bigger picture understanding of all of this stuff, which we see as kind of being these influences on what it is that we're studying. And, you know, at the workshop, we made a pretty kind of, we made it was pretty clear that we were going to be focusing in on what's going on in place. But really, it's been these concentric circles which has been the main driving thing, which has unified, has stayed throughout this whole process. So we took those concentric circles and tried to sort of elaborate on what that really meant in terms of which elements of the sort of social, climate, and ecological systems we were going to be focused on. And we've used this Venn diagram to communicate with our stakeholders to try and show that, you know, while we're really interested in what's going on in the ecological systems in this landscape, we're really very concerned with those ecological systems and processes which also have value to people who live in this landscape, or value to the economies of the landscape. And so that kind of project focus in the middle here was really, is a way to make sure that we don't end up kind of with a project which sort of there's lots of stuff in here that sits at the intersection of social and ecological systems that's threatened or vulnerable or changing in this landscape, but maybe not necessarily that the main driving changes are changes in the climate system. And, you know, same goes in this spot in here and in here. So, but one of the things about this way of bounding the project focus is that a lot of the guiding principles that we developed, which were so helpful in kind of shaping the way that we've been thinking about the research design and the project more broadly, have been lost. And so I've been kind of playing with trying to think about how we could reintegrate the guiding principles into this much more simplistic understanding of our conceptual framework. And obviously this doesn't kind of capture a lot of the complexity that's involved with the Turner et al. Framework, but this is really where our project seems to be focusing in on. And so we also, in the span ones at least, have made a decision that we're not really focused on the social system writ large. While we're really still very concerned about the sort of social value of the ecological systems here, we're much more focused on the agency decision-making context. And so we sort of have made some pragmatic decisions in relation to, you know, the ideal project where we would be able to do everything with what it is that we actually have the capacity to focus on and what it was that we were really funded to focus on, which is helping to understand the sort of decision-making context of adaptation in this landscape. And then around the edge, you have these really important considerations of complexity and uncertainty and scale and this kind of usable knowledge, and working with the land managers to try and develop knowledge that draws on both their expertise but also on ours. And then trying to understand the sort of differential vulnerability and adaptive capacity of the agencies within this landscape. So where we're kind of going right now is trying to reframe the way we do the research project so that the interactions that we as a research team have with our stakeholders is not just designed to be kind of generating knowledge for this project, but also ways in which we can be giving something back to the very busy agency staff who will be giving us their time. So we're trying to kind of develop our workshops in a way that's going to be building capacity and sharing knowledge of kind of climate adaptation, climate change writ large, but then more tailored and specified to this local context. And so this little bit in the center there, the adaptation pathways bit, is where we're going to move away from sort of starting with a vulnerability-based focus and an aspiration to kind of madly collect lots of knowledge and understanding of vulnerability writ large in this system, to really focus more on starting with the decision context. And so still bearing these kind of concentric circles in mind, understanding what decisions the land managers are making, and then how over time those decisions may be affected by changing stressors, both sort of climate and non-climate stressors, to really kind of see how the knowledge that we develop about the sort of social and ecological concerns and values in the landscape can be integrated into current decision-making processes and pathways. And so the idea of adaptation pathways is to start from where people are at and develop sort of a pathway is the culmination of multiple different strategies, some of which are targeted more at the existing vulnerabilities and stressors and the decisions that land managers are making right now. And then other strategies, may need to be put in place right now, but they're not going to take effect for quite some time, but they're really targeted at assessing those future vulnerabilities that are a consequence of much longer term and more significant changes. And so an example that was given to me by a land manager down here, or water manager down here, sorry, was that in the 2002 drought, there was quite a lot of conflict associated with the management of the range and grazing. And so at that time, they developed a rangeland stewardship group. And that stewardship group didn't really help them with that current crisis that they were facing right now, but the collaborative process, which takes a long time, has really helped them to understand and work through some of those conflicts so that when the next drought came along, some of those issues had been resolved. So this is really acknowledging that you need a diverse mix of strategies in your adaptation pathway to try and help you to address current vulnerabilities and future vulnerabilities. And then, so I guess tying it all together, this is a really complex process, and we really do need some kind of conceptual framework to help us to try and integrate the different aspects of this project. And the process that we went through to develop the framework was really, really helpful. The workshop, I think we all left that workshop feeling quite exhausted, but also excited about the project. And I think that that process itself, even if we never look at that big complex framework again, I think that process was really, really very helpful. But from the survey which I did of the PIs, it would appear that while the framework is less prominent right now, people do see a role for us to continue to revisit that in future project meetings where we come together, and then in the analysis to try and see whether or not some of those assumptions that we had embedded within that initial framework held true or were useful in guiding where we got to. Personally, I feel like perhaps we got a little bit too caught up in our own complexity, and one of our guiding principles was to both acknowledge and bind the complexity, but try and balance that with some kind of simplification. And so that's sort of where I've been going in trying to guide the San Juan work towards something which still captures those key points about integrating social and ecological and climate concerns, but while also is something that's sort of simple enough for us to get our heads around and still help to guide us forwards. So I think, at our next project meeting, we probably need to revisit the conceptual framework as a project team as a whole and think about, where we want to go from there. But there's a couple of members of the project team on the call right now, and I sort of thought that before we opened it up to questions more generally, I would like to put you all on the spot and invite you to share your thoughts on the framework.
Carina, this is Shannon. I just wanted to make one little point, which is I think one of the additional values of having the framework just as a way to think about it, not as something, and we said this all along, it's just articulating it for the people on the webinar, that it wasn't ever meant to be sort of a static conceptual framework for the whole project. It can be thought of more as like a springboard or a reference point from which to jump off in terms of the evolution or the development of the project. And one of the values of sort of having that framework and documenting that process is that you can sort of track the intellectual evolution of the project and also have a place to come back to as needed as you're doing the analysis, and also importantly as you're sort of writing up the scholarly publications to have that intellectual ground from which you have evolved the intellectual components of the project. So and also that, one of the things that we talked about in the workshop and has been the struggle all along is this tension between when you're, the science to practice interface and how you have the sort of intellectual components of the analysis from a social science and ecosystems and climate perspective, but that's not necessarily what you communicate to the practitioners, so to speak. So it's finding that balance in between of how do you actually take this framework and make it something that's meaningful to the stakeholders that you're working with, but not getting into the deeper complexity of all of those intellectual components.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and thanks, Shannon. I guess that was like exactly what you're saying about the evolution there is sort of what I was kind of attempting to convey with this process, because I think it is an evolving process, and it has, as you say, comes, we're documenting how it's evolving over time, and that there are a whole bunch of complexities that we're not going to be communicating with the stakeholders themselves. But I also have found that I think within the project team, a sense that some of what is embodied in this bigger, complex analytical project was too overwhelming in certain ways, and so I think it's still there, and it's still, as the PIs all seem to have reflected, that it is something that we need to keep going back to, and we should be continuing to go back to. And so that's just, part of the ongoing evaluation. And, the footsteps in this presentation were supposed to be that kind of metaphor for the journey that we continue to go on together.
Carina, this is Nina. Great job. I really appreciated hearing you talk about this. I think one of the things that's interesting is that, as you've gotten into the project and as you've, really started to think through this more, you've done some of these, you've adapted this framework a little bit. You're really thinking about how we operationalize this. And I think that's incredibly useful, because I do think that a lot of us, by the end of the workshop, were a little overwhelmed and really needed something like this to step this down for us a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then my other thing that's interesting, I think, is that it'll be useful to watch how the Gunnison part of this project approaches this, and whether they can take what you've done and how you're thinking about it, and whether that will work for them, whether they'll think through this in a somewhat different way because they're dealing with different targets. I think that process will also be interesting, and I guess as a team we should really talk about that, not at this moment, but at some point. So, I'm really interested to see what you've done with this.
Renee? Yes.
Hello, this is Renee. And hey, Kurt, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Carina, you did a great job. Thank you so much for describing a complex framework in a pretty simplified way. So I think it helps. And I like what Nina said, that we need to keep taking our knowledge, putting it back into the framework, rethinking how this all works as we go through. It is a very complex project, and I think all of us knew it was complex in the beginning, but I think we have a much better feeling for how complex it is now. And the complexities both come from having a large team as well as having a large project area, as well as having a lot of stakeholders from different agencies and tribes. And this framework, as we develop it, I think grounds us, and I like the idea of coming back to it on a periodic basis, just to say, okay, what have we learned? How do we readjust the framework? Because in the end, I think this is something that we can publish, and we can talk about the process of how we got here and how we adjust it as we go through it. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Renee.
Nice accent noise. Whoop.
Carina, this is Marcy with Mountain Studies Institute, and what I would add to my comment on the framework and the process has been that we recognize that our ultimate goal is to innovate the process for informing decision-making towards achieving social, ecological, integrated adaptation planning. And so our conceptual model currently reflects that integration and that situated context and knowledge that we're hoping for. Our next iteration will be to try and express the process better of how we will achieve that and liken that to adaptation planning. And so that's kind of where we're headed next.
Yeah, thanks, Marcy. And my head's exploding right now about what kinds of crazy diagrams we're going to be coming up with to try and visualize that. But I'm sure when we get to it, we'll come up with something. Does anyone else on the call? I'm not even really sure who is there. Have anything to add or questions?
This is Diane Dubinsky. I have a question, but Jeff, I hear you're asking a question too.
No, go ahead.
So I think this is really interesting, and I would like to see if you could share this Prezi with us by email. That would be awesome. One question I had was, will there be another stage where this kind of conversation takes a different format but goes to the people who live in the ecosystem to try to have them understand these relationships between climate, ecological systems, and decision-making that they make on their own property, or that groups of people make together about these areas?
The answer to some of that question goes to what Shannon had said just straight after I finished about this. You know, there's certain aspects of this complexity that we would not want to be discussing with the decision makers. But then, you know, sorry if I can just get to this bit, we have put up in presentation with our local stakeholders here, so those stakeholders being agency representatives. And the way in which we're envisaging structuring the next stages of the project is to hold workshops which will be really targeted at kind of a particular framing of how to go about doing adaptation, how to go about thinking about adaptation in their work. And so the project here in the San Juans has focused on two systems mainly, so steep springs and wetlands, and then pinyon juniper ecosystems or ecological communities. And those were really chosen because they sit at that kind of intersection, and the whole way through this process will be kind of framing the conversation with managers about, you know, what it is about those ecological systems and the social values that you currently manage those systems for. So what is it about those values that are currently threatened by climate change, and what in your management can be done to enable you to continue to manage those systems for the values that people kind of currently aspire to have from them. So, so yes and no, I guess, is the answer to that question. Some of that big analytical complexity is not going to go there, but we really will be, the idea is to try and kind of build knowledge and capacity to think about these systems in that integrated way.
Okay, and the managers would be the end users of the product primarily.
Yes. Yeah, so we focus really on public agency decision makers and the Ute Mountain Ute tribe.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe my comment could tail into that I think that is the managers being the end users. This is Jeff commenting. But I think there's also an end user that is the climate science research community to understand this process. I think a lot of studies that have been funded, either LCCs or USGS or the Climate Science Centers, are the red and the green circles and kind of that intersection. And a lot of them have, you know, they're justified and do have some bearing in, you know, activity or management that has to happen. But I think there's been less so kind of looking at all three of those, how they come together, and the science of the science. And I think that there's a lot of interest in it. I think there's kind of quite a few now vulnerability assessments out there. There's a growing number of adaptation plans. There's work the Park Service has done in scenario planning, and there's now a National Conservation Training Center course on scenario planning. So I think there's now quite a bit that's kind of looking at least the red and the green intersection. And again, you know, it's obviously rooted in some, you know, kind of management of the species or, you know, kind of management on public lands, but less so this whole grasp of how it comes together and the science of the science. And when we had our briefing with the national office, they sort of valued this as a project that's really going to kind of contribute to that. So it's a framework, and so yeah, I think that you got to start with the land managers and give them what they need. But I think it's secondary and kind of important and a nice, you know, valuable part of this project is that a wider research community understand how that's brought together. And I think it's neat to see the more kind of detailed framework. And then I was at the managers meeting in Durango, where they showed just this distillation of it, and that sort of had them understand it, but, you know, kept the researchers grounded in where the larger framework is. So it seems to be moving along nicely, and I think it is going to be valuable to have that bigger picture, co-production of knowledge, the science of the science, that big picture of how it comes together.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm glad you made that point. And just to build on that is, I definitely see this as a multi-directional sort of learning effort, where you've got, you know, the managers in the system, you've got the broader research community that Jeff was talking about, but I would even say the social or social ecological systems vulnerability and adaptation research community as well can really benefit, and there's a lot of value added from this, because like Jeff said, that full integration of social, ecological, and climate has been really thorny and really difficult to get at. And so I see this project and you know, in line with the greater sort of effort of the North Central Climate Science Center to really do this integration and inform the literature as immensely valuable, because any social vulnerability and adaptation researcher starts at that really complex sort of reality of these integrated systems, and how you actually carve that out into a manageable project that has outcomes that are useful is always challenging. And so I think there's going to be a lot of value back into that literature from this project as well.
Yeah, it's really great to hear you both say that. I mean, we are putting in a lot of effort to try and document that learning, both through the sort of evaluations that we're doing of ourselves. And I'm also kind of viewing this project and my role in this project as doing an ethnography of, I'm calling it an ethnography of adaptation. And so, you know, an ethnography is a tool that anthropologists use to kind of go, you know, back in the day where they would go and like hang out with a tribe in the middle of nowhere to understand what these people do and how they live. So I'm using those tools and techniques from anthropology to try and document this project, and will hopefully be, and I'm planning to write that up to kind of expose the challenges and opportunities and learnings and frustrations and excitement that we as a project team, largely through my eyes, have kind of been through in this process, to hope that you know, documenting what adaptation researchers do, not just their outputs, will make some kind of a contribution to that kind of intellectual community.
I think that one of the things to remind ourselves is that this sort of transformative thinking that we're developing here is really sort of an evolutionary process, and it takes time for some of the intellectual thinking in this framework to really take seed and actually get implemented. But I think the exercise of actually going through in a collaborative way, thinking from various perspectives what makes sense, and develop, you know, sort of co-developing the framework was a useful exercise. And even for someone who knew some of the papers beforehand, I think listening to other people's perspectives on their interpretation of the papers that, you know, one person reads and someone else responds to was quite helpful for all of us to go through. And how we interpret that and use it in the future is going to be an individual, I guess, manifestation. But I think jointly all of us benefited from being at that workshop. And it's a process that we may want to think about how to repeat with other projects or other groups, because it is a useful way of actually sharing information and actually growing your perspective to respect these other viewpoints.
Yeah, I mean, if you, as a climate science center, have the capacity to repeat that process, I mean, the feedback from our team, I think, is that it was great. I mean, it was really, I think we all really valued that workshop. I think we all learned a lot through reading and reviewing the papers, even if you had read them before, but also from each other. And that shared learning has continued. I know Renee and Imtiaz, the project climate scientist, and I have been working at the moment to develop narrative scenarios for this process, and it's just been this really great learning for the three of us. Renee, I'm speaking to you right now. We're all three of us are kind of learning about where each, you know, meeting the requirements of what we each need to get out of this one thing, being the scenarios that we're going to use. And I think some of the foundation for that learning and that capacity for us to have those conversations was set through that workshop. So if you guys can do it again, you definitely should, I would say.
I wonder if there's an opportunity at the National Adaptation Conference Workshop
Adaptation Forum yeah.
in May of 15, right? To think, it's probably not too early to start integrating with, exchanging with the conference host to see if a day or an afternoon session would be, you know, to share these lessons learned by other people who want to look at the big picture of these three topics and intersect to adaptation.
No, that's a great idea. We should think about that. Yeah, they just started to. Did you see that, Carina, the save the date for the May National Adaptation Forum?
Yeah, I think I saw it. Yeah, I did. I'm not actually going to be in the country, but yes, I did see it. And if you guys put something together, and I'd be happy to help in some way if needed.
You just won't lead it since you'll be in the country.
Skype you in.
Yeah.
So that's very nice.
Great. So, Dennis, I don't know, in the interest of time and making sure we get, if anybody has, we do try to open it up to any issues, concerns between funded PIs or university consortia. So I'll start with you, Dennis, and you can, I don't know if there's anything to report or share. We got about 15 minutes. Open it up to that.
I don't have anything new to respond to. I guess, well, one thing that we're working on right now, there will be a all CSC directors and PIs meeting in June in Minneapolis, and so we're collecting ideas for the agenda for that. We're hoping that we'll focus on a lot of the research into collaborative efforts, and so the social ecological system framing is one of those topics that we'll definitely put on the table. It's an area that other regions are looking to develop. One thing that Jeff has been doing also in relation to the emerging or the newly identified USDA climate hubs is providing a dialogue among the agencies to look at how do we frame the collaborative and synergistic activities. And I think we're going to, any feedback that you all have that would be quite helpful as we move forward with this, and then we'll actually have that probably as a topic for our joint meeting in June as well. So I'll just end it there.
And Dennis, just to add to that, this is Shannon, just as a reminder, our next webinar in April is going to be on the DRIVE project, the Drought Risk and Adaptation in the Interior, that I'll be presenting. And we are talking to the cross-CSC Social Ecological Systems Adaptation Working Group that Dennis and I lead, about having some of those folks sit in on that webinar, and then we're going to have a follow-up conversation about how this ties into that broader cross-CSC drought theme that Dennis just mentioned, because, of course, that group is trying to promote this type of integration approach across the whole CSC system. And so that is going to be an ongoing dialogue, and then that group is thinking about putting together some kind of a white paper or something for that June all-CSC meeting. So it goes beyond just the North Central Climate Science Center.
And while you mention it, just a note, that meeting is the 5th Tuesday of the month, not the 4th, so a little bit different than usual. We usually use the 4th Tuesday, but we're doing our climate change vulnerability assessment course in Jackson that week, the week of the 4th Tuesday, so it's the 5th Tuesday, April 29th. Yeah. I can report that the announcement of the solicitation has been delayed. I think that the delay is trying to make sure we get from our Office of Acquisitions and Grants the proper format for a budget, and the delay is worth it in that there won't be as much iteration after projects are selected, that OAG will have all the details they need when the projects are submitted, and they should be able to kind of review them as we review the science content and data management plan, as opposed to where it was last time. We reviewed science content, data management plans, selected projects, and then had way too many and way too circular emails on budgets and details of budgets and what had to happen. And any of the PIs are familiar with that painful process. So just stay tuned for an announcement on the solicitation. It'll probably come out in early April, maybe even April 1st. I'll have 2 question and answer sessions just related to the solicitation, and the national office will have a question and answer session, and that's probably more for the budget people working at the universities. Then the 2 sessions I'll have will be related to what we're trying to accomplish, and it will be very similar to last year's solicitation, and trying to get this decision-focused project to integrate across the 3 climate, ecosystems, and social and human dimensions.
Jeff, is there going to be, this is Diane, is there going to be a pre-proposal format followed by a full proposal in this next RFP, do you think?
Yes. Yes, similar
Okay.
to last time,
Okay.
short proposal, or I think they call them statement of intent. But yes,
Okay.
that will be, and those will be, you'll have a month after, I think 2 months after it might be shortened a little bit, the delay, but like 6 to 8 weeks to write your statement of intent.
Okay.
So please stay tuned on that.
Anything more? If not, I want to thank Carina again. That was a really nice presentation, and I finally got onto WebEx and saw the important parts of it. A reminder, as Jeff and Shannon noted, April 29th, we'll have the drought risk adaptation in the interior presentation, being the 5th Tuesday. And on May 27th, we'll follow with the regional climate model that John Stamm and Parker Norton will present. So stay tuned for those, and you'll see an announcement on our new newsletter sort of documentation with MailChimp, which has been quite useful and nicely presented. Without any further questions, I guess we'll call it a day here.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Carina.
Great.
Yeah, very nice to see you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take
All
care.
right.
Bye.
Bye.
I have to do it here.